The scope of the presentation today is going to cover, number one, the mobile arena. And what's meant by the mobile arena is basically the complexities that make mobile different from desktop testing and web-based application testing. Then we'll talk about the items that should be tested as they relate to mobile. And then what can be covered, of those, what can be covered with automation, and what tools are being used out there that are relatively robust, that can be harnessed into a solution, that are worth exploring, and then how should those tools be implemented. So of course with anything there's some best practices, so at a high level we'll try to discover which ones are practical in the mobile space right now. So in our first topic, mobile arena, the first thing to understand is that the term fragmentation, you'll hear this come up a lot, and what that refers to is the different manufacturers that are producing phones and the different operating systems that run on those phones, and all of that combination provides probably thousands of different permutations of platforms that applications are running on. And of course that means that they need to be tested as well. And those fragmentation items actually really have an impact on how the application processing works, how the features in the application work, and really how the GUIs, the actual UI level, presents itself to the users. Another element that adds to the fragmentation is the carriers. So we know there's AT&T, we know there's Verizon, there's a host of other ones. In Europe, there's differences between the way the internet backbones work over in Europe as opposed to the United States. So if you have a mobile application that needs to be worldwide, these are some considerations that when you're in the lab developing an application, you're not necessarily thinking about. So carriers and locations is another element. And then whether you're building a native, a hybrid, or a web application, native applications are those applications that you actually get from the store. You download them, they put an icon on your phone desktop, if you will. And when you open those up, everything that occurs happens on the application itself, on the phone itself. And then with the web, that's obviously you're in your mobile device, you open up a browser, and you start interacting with an optimized website in that capacity. And then, of course, there's the hybrid version, which is basically a shell of a native application that you can download from the store, but when you open it, it basically opens up, has web components functioning inside the shell. The problem is that there's a lack of standards, so you'll hear another term that's called in the wild. And what in the wild basically means is when there's lack of standards, there's really best practices. And here's a couple of organizations that speak to those best practices that are out there. And the first one is WC3, and that provides some web standards. And then there's an organization called WAC, which provides some application and carrier provisions. And these organizations are community-based, so they try to get together to provide some type of standards and best practices so that developers can grab and research those and come up with some things that they can implement in-house. So all in all, it's a highly competitive industry, and managers have to consider how to get their product to market right away, how to constantly update things, how to being careful of the defects that their developers are adding into the application, and they also have to be careful of the platform updates, platforms meaning anything that comes with the operating systems. For example, Google owns the Android operating system, so there's a risk that Google could potentially put something in their operating system updates that mess up the applications. And just give you a second here to look at the statistics, but this is a snapshot from September 2011 to 2012 of the different manufacturers that are out there, so you can get a sense of that. And then these are the different operating systems that are popular right now. So in our next section, what should be tested? Well, obviously the number one starting point is the actual installation of the applications. And in this in this section, the installation actually in the Android space has a file called the Android manifest. And what this controls is actually the requirements that a developer lists out basically before they submit their application to the App Store. And it tells the App Store what's required so that a person can, number one, search and find the application that a development house had just put out. And so, for example, if the application required GPS capability, any device that doesn't have GPS capability won't be able to see that application. So this is actually one of an important test, is to make sure that that manifest file gets filled out correctly, so that there's not any extra requirements in there that would stop users from actually seeing and finding the application in the App Store. Some other things that need to be tested as far as the installation goes is whether the application needs certain access to certain features on the phone. A lot of times, I'm sure folks have noticed when you download that before the application installs, it warns you, it says, I need access to your contact list, or I need access to your location, and it prompts the user to actually confirm that they want to allow that to happen. And if it does, then and it's not supposed to, that could be a problem, and it's definitely an installation defect. On the functional side, there's requirements and updating, and this is pretty standard. This is more in line with what folks in the QA world would be used to as far as regular automation goes. So there's functional doesn't conceptually add any complexities at this point. There's still a need for requirements, and there's still a need to understand how updates are going to be applied once the application is initially rolled out, and then what needs to come along after that. In performance, there is the battery, memory, and processing, and this also along with load and stress testing that happens more at a network level. But performance-wise, on the device itself, if an application is taking up too much of its fair share of the battery or memory, or making the device processor run more than it should, then these are all areas that need to be identified and monitored for performance capabilities, any defects that might be going on there. And it's a little bit different than desktop, because a lot of times we assume things are going to function okay on desktop. There's a lot of memory on these things. There's usually more than enough of processing power. But when you start talking about applications functioning on a small device, these are the variables that need to be tested. From a usability standpoint, this is how easy or hard the application appears to the user. A lot of times the goal is to create an application that's intuitive. The user at this point expects to download something and immediately know how to take advantage of it without having to read an instruction manual or anything like that. So usability is another big thing that's popular out in the field to be tested. Security is important. Security has to do with conforming to different standards that are currently in development, but a lot of them don't necessarily translate over into the mobile space. What mobile security has a lot to do with is, as I mentioned before, prompting the user for access to certain items, and then what's the expectation for, if you have access to a contact list, where is that data going, and what does the vendor of the application actually intend to do with it? And new rules are coming out all the time and posted by governments and just general industry best practices. If you want to be part of certain organizations, you have to promise to conform to certain standards, and it's all centered around that information. One example is OWASP, and OWASP provides that type of worldwide. It's a nonprofit organization, and it's really set up, number one, to provide guidance for developers, but also to educate end users as to what it means when you actually accept those prompts that say, yes, you can access my contact list. So what can be covered with automation? Number one, certainly performance. In the web space, we know that there's performance tools out there that monitor web traffic, that give us all types of great statistics, and very similar to the load and stress testing that goes on for web-based applications. The same thing can be applied for mobile. And there's tools that are designed to do analytics, to do load testing, to actually monitor the traffic. And they monitor the traffic on a actual mobile network and generate statistics based off of that. So these tools can be pointed at networks at like AT&T, where the application, where it starts its monitoring at the application level on a particular device, and then correlates those statistics with what happens on the back end, like a server, when that data gets transferred over the internet to a server. And then because the battery and the processing on the phone are actually important, a lot of that information as well gets correlated in, and that's all being analyzed at the tool level. From a security standpoint, there's tools that can scan traffic once again and look for vulnerabilities, see if anything's being transmitted that should be encrypted, that isn't being encrypted, or that's sensitive data. There's tools that will cherry pick that information for you and present it to you, so that can be done in an automated fashion. And for locations, as I mentioned before, location is an interesting dynamic when testing applications. An example I like to use is, suppose we were developing an application for McDonald's, and the application's job was to, no matter where we are in the world, it tells us where the closest McDonald's is so that we can go get something to eat. And how do you test this capability if you're developing it in a location, in a one-spot location somewhere? There's actually tools out there, and this is assuming that the application is going to be referencing GPS capabilities. There's tools out there that will let you inject coordinates, faking coordinates, and it will pull up a location based on what coordinates you inject into the application at that point. So you can essentially mimic where you are anywhere in the world and then test to see if the right McDonald's is showing up. And in functional, certainly we can cover our functional UI test cases. An interesting statistic, the IDC, which is another large data analysis firm that collects information on one of their categories is telecommunication. And in their studies, they found that close to 80 to 90% of all tests that are being done on mobile devices are being done manually. So this, in the functional realm, certainly automation, this is where the bang for the buck is in applying a solution. All the other ones up here, performance, security, and location, those automation tools are interesting and very useful, but what people want, the immediate information that they get to certify whether their application is working correctly, they immediately jump down to functional testing. They immediately want to download the application and start hammering on it to see how it performs. That's where they're getting their quickest information from. So this is really why functional UI testing is where automation solutions should be applied. And the popular places to apply them are, number one, any in-house development. Developers like to have the ability to run some automated routines and get the results they need after they put out a build. Doing end-to-end testing for more of a UAT audience. To do continuous integration. So if we have an application, we put out a build, we immediately want it to kick off a series of smoke tests. We want those test cases to be intuitive, and we also want these functional test cases. The reason why it's important to have such a tight and well-defined regression bed is because applications are constantly being updated. If you've ever looked at your device and you see on your utilities icon or your App Store icon, sometimes it flashes a red number at you that says 4, meaning you have 4 updates. So the applications that are on your phone have new features or fixes or versions that need to be updated. So because this is happening for the users, before any of those updates go out the door, it would be nice to have regression tests that you can run before you put those updates out there. And that's just a cycle that's going to continue to occur for the life cycle of the application. What tools can be automated? Can be used to automate? Web services. Mobile devices use a lot of web services, and a web service can basically be defined as a way of taking data from the device and passing it to the back end without going through the UI. And really what's happening is that a file in a format of XML or JSON is being created, and it has specific data, and that data can relate to a test case, and it's put into one of these 2 formats, then submitted over the internet, and then processed on the back end. And then a response is passed back to the device that the information was processed, or the next set of data to move the device screen along is available, and that gets passed from the back end to where the application is. And this is another way to think about it is every time you're working in your UI, so that you have a finished product, you have a finished application, and you're filling out a screen that says you're just logging in, so you're putting in your username, password, and clicking a submit button. Your text, your username and password goes into one of these formats and gets submitted when the button is pushed. and it's like a file that gets sent over the internet. And the important thing here is, the takeaway here is that these web services are available before the UI is created. So the data can be put into these formats and submitted, and testing can occur without there actually being a UI created anyways. And a lot of tools that test this will take in the data in some type of a spreadsheet format, and then based on the mapping of the spreadsheet, it will create these file formats and then initiate these submits. So this is really the first layer of automation that can occur even before teams start thinking about how they want the application to look. Some other tools are the emulators in the simulators. So an emulator is an emulator or simulator is basically Android and iPhone's version of displaying a virtual machine image that has the same look and feel as a device you would deploy your application on. So you run an emulator or a simulator, and then you load your application onto the emulator or simulator, and then you can see the application that you develop functioning. And it's good for verifying screen flows. It's good for making sure objects are coming out correctly. But we'll get into this in a little while. But for testing purposes, it's not very deep, and it's not deep enough. But you can verify those things, and you can start to create automation on these tools. It's a great starter, and it's a very useful technique. It's just not a complete technique. And so the emulator belongs to Android, and it's part of the Android SDK. And the simulator is the iPhone platform. It's part of Xcode. For anybody that's interested, if you don't know Android, you can download for free, and you can start playing around with the features in there, develop some sample applications to start with, and you can actually see what these emulators look like. There's some remote service providers And those two big examples of remote service providers are Keynote Device Anywhere and Perfecto Mobile. And they're really interesting because what they've developed is basically a data center that hosts a variety of different devices. Basically, you know, hundreds, maybe thousands of devices. And this gives the ability for application development teams to get access to all the devices with the different carriers, with the different operating systems, and they can go to one service provider to get access to all the things that they need. So these are two big companies that provide that, and these companies also provide automation capabilities. There's open source options out there. Two of my favorite ones are MonkeyTalk, and then Selenium has a version to run on browsers of the different operating systems. So these are free, available. You know, you have to, for MonkeyTalk, you sign up and you get a download and you get a whole development kit for running some automation. You have to have a device either tethered to your laptop or development box, or you can access it over Wi-Fi. But as long as you have one device, you can accomplish running automation on that one particular device. And you can also use these products to run on the simulators. So even if you don't have a device and you want to just get started with right over the internet, you can download all these free tools and put it together and run these right on your laptop and then the final example out there for popular automation techniques is what I call extenders. And what this is some third-party vendors that will develop libraries that you can import into tools like QTP. QTP is a very, very popular web and desktop automation tool. So to extend itself out to mobile, these third-party vendors create these libraries, and again, you're going to be expected to provide the phones themselves, and you can tether those to your development box that has QTP. But then the commands that you create after importing these libraries, C-Test is an example of one of these third-party vendors, you'll be able to create the automation steps to run on those devices. So some pros and cons here with taking these approaches. So with web services, like I mentioned, the testing can begin before the UI is even developed, because the UI is going to reference those web services, and the UI at some point is going to be mapping data to the formats that I had mentioned. So we can create those through different tools and use something like a spreadsheet to create our data variation. And we can do this pretty quickly with low maintenance. And really what we're certifying is the service-oriented architecture that was created before the application was even conceived. And we're probably reusing components of our development, of our application environments. A lot of times web applications can share the same web services as mobile applications. So these items are here and probably developed already. The cons is that it's referred to as a headless application. That's just to reinforce what I just said about it being not having a UI. So that's what's termed headless. Not all device functionality is covered. So not everything that that the developer is going to use for the application is covered by a web service. So we're still going to need that functional testing level that the level that we're presenting to the user, and we want to test that out from beginning to end, because not all the features are going to be covered through these web services. And web services, it's an evolving technology. Not everybody in the QA space necessarily understands that or has exposure to it. So it's going to be important in mobile that that QA teams understand web services and get far more involved with them. So from a knowledge standpoint, it's an evolving technology. The remote service providers, so their benefits are on-demand fragmentation, handling all those areas of fragmentation that we covered. They're subscription-based, so you can turn them on or turn them off as you need to. And the automation, the service is actually a cloud-based service. And you download a client component on your PC, and you connect over the internet to see all the phones that you're licensed for in their data center. So you have complete view of that. And because of that, it makes it easy to outsource this capability to third parties that you want to help, that you want to hire to have them develop the test cases for you. They simply just need that client install on their machines in whatever location they happen to be in, and they'll be able to get to the data center and see everything that you're seeing from your home office. On the con side, they have a reputation for being expensive, and this is certainly a judgment call from management teams that do they want to, is there a return on investment, and if they, obviously they do their homework ahead of time and decide this is something they want to spend money on, then it's it's good for everybody. But typically for small businesses or smaller organizations or organizations that don't have a big QA budget, it can the expense can get a bit pricey. There can be some occasional latency, like I mentioned. There's, this all depends. We're connected to all of these things over the internet, although some of the bigger service providers have the ability to take their entire solution and host it in-house. But where you'll see that, then you wouldn't have this latency or lag. But for those that are accessing everything over the internet, you're subject to the limitations of either your internal network or the internet network at large. And then in order to, in some cases, for some of these vendors, they need to jailbreak or root their devices. And jailbreaking or rooting simply means that the device is in a elevated state of access. It's like it's like logging on with admin access for your PC. And the reason that they have to take these measures is for some providers, they need to do this in order to provide their solution. They need to put it in this elevated state. And the problem here is that any testing that occurs on it probably isn't reflecting what the typical user of your application is going to have out in the field when they download it from the App Store. So they're probably going to have normal access on their phone. There's going to be certain people out there that just want to jailbreak or root their phone, but it's going to be a small subset. And the takeaway there is that you're testing items on a device that's not in a typical state, and this may or may not be a good reflection of the test cases that the pass-fail criteria that you're trying to get by running test cases on these devices. And this is not meant to say that all service providers do this. Some of them do, and I put this note here because if you're interested in pursuing one of these options with a remote service provider, this is a question you'll probably want to ask them, is whether they're jailbreaking or rooting their devices in order to provide you their services. Emulators and simulators, pros and cons. I mentioned some of these before. Obviously, the biggest benefit is that these tools are already part of the development environment, so they're probably already in place, and they're free. They're free in the sense that in Android they're definitely free. With iPhone, because the iPhone world, because it's proprietary, there's probably a fee associated with it, but once that's been done, development teams and QA teams have full access of the capabilities that are inside those development environments. From the cons, as I mentioned before, you're not getting the fragmentation. You're essentially running a VM image of a device. You're deploying the application on something that's really taking full advantage of the processing power and the rendering of the PC. So there's you have a lot more at the application has a lot more to work with because it's really functioning off of the PC as opposed to the smaller devices. And any network activity that occurs is going over Ethernet, and it's not really going over the carrier's network. So this just reinforces the point that when you're to do a proper sign-off verification of any testing, it needs to be done on a real device, and it needs to be done with different carriers. On the open source side, they're great mainly because they're free. You can get your hands on them right away, and if there's some pains in setting it up, but once you get past those, you basically have everything set up and you haven't paid anything for it, and you can go ahead and start scripting, go through some traditional record and playbacks to get familiar with it, and all in all, the documentation is pretty good. The cons is that in order to get the functionality to work, to be able to create some automated tests, what they require you to do is put an agent inside of your application build. So in most cases, you'll have to take this plug-in, if you will, and ask your development team to compile it in with a build of the application. And once that's done, then you can essentially initiate a record and playback session so that the automation tool that you'll be using can then communicate with the application that's running in the device. So that handshake needs to be established. So that's an extra step other than being able to just open up an automation tool and point it at a application and then immediately start doing a record and playback. You have to give this agent to the development team in order to make that happen. And then, of course, the biggest thing is that since it's open source, you're essentially on your own to support yourself, and it's not guaranteed to work. And sometimes you can find yourself in a loop where you're researching a solution to try to get your open source solution to work correctly. The extenders, they're nice because, to summarize, the biggest pro here is that you can work in a product that you're already used to working in. So if you're a QTP shop and you purchase a QTP extender from a third party and you're successful at importing it, you can immediately start creating test cases, and you're working with the screens and workflows of QTP. So that is all presents you as the automation developer with a familiar environment, and you can use all the full features of that environment. And then the cons is that you still, even though you've spent some money to get the third-party solution, you still have to find a way to run it on different devices to take full advantage. And this would be like a direct comparison between this solution and getting a remote service provider. And the remote service provider can give you their automation solution. You can develop in their environment, and then you also have the added benefit of running it on the hundreds or thousands of devices that they have. Whereas in this case, you're using your QTP or your familiar environment, but now you have to maybe look in-house to find devices to run it on, and so that's essentially the negative for the extenders. And this section here will talk about at a high level what's the best practices for implementing these tools. So conceptually, they're similar discipline to your web and desktop applications. And that just means if you're used to...
Patrick, we have a question. It's about the previous slide on UAT. So one more back from there, I believe. Yeah, so can't get outside the AUT agent-based. And someone was asking, they weren't clear about that point.
Sure. Good question. So for an example, one test case that I had, the test case started off in the actual application that I wanted to test. This was a advertising application. So you put in your information about your favorite, your favorite restaurant that you like to eat at. You fill out the first 3 screens with that information and filling out their questionnaire. And then in the test case, it says, okay, I want to be able to integrate with Facebook. So click on the Facebook link and then start filling out some screens in Facebook and then come back into the application that I'm originally testing to complete the interview, if you will. The part that involves Facebook, you can't. That's where the record and playback or the automated scripting would stop. And the reason that is because there's no agent inside of Facebook that allows me to connect the automation engine to pick up or play back the items that I want to do inside of Facebook to complete those steps. I'm just bound to the application that I'm testing because that's the only thing that has the agent in it.
Okay, great. There's another question here. In the emulators and simulators slide, do we need to install any add-ons for unit test automation?
It's back here a little bit, right?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead with the question again, please.
The question is, do we need to install any add-ons for unit testing automation?
No. So as far as the emulators go, taking the Android emulator, for example, the unit testing capability are JUnit tests, and all you need to do is, if you're working in Eclipse is the popular development environment. You download the Android SDK and you configure those two together. You can then work in Eclipse to take full advantage of the Android SDK. Inside of there, you can create JUnit unit test cases, which will, and then you can point those JUnit test cases to the application that's running in your emulator. So all of that's, so once you get to the point of where you've configured Eclipse, which is where you're going to do your application development and your unit test case development, you can run everything inside of the emulator and point it to the emulator.
Okay, great. Another question, are there extenders for Selenium 2?
In my experience with Selenium, what there are is the web-based that work on the web browsers that render for the applications that render in the devices. You can actually run it on the devices. So those extenders, it's kind of the same practice where once you download Eclipse, you can pull in Selenium inside of Eclipse as well and start utilizing the mobile browser capabilities, the functions or the APIs from there. The other thing that Selenium Mobile requires is that you run their server, their server component, which is can be a little bit confusing at times, but there's actually some good documentation out there of how to start it. And again, using Android as an example, once you start the server, what happens is a WebDriver shell that runs the HTTP traffic will show up in your emulator. So that's how you know you've made a successful connection between Selenium and the emulator, and then you can start running your tests inside of there. Any more questions?
No, that's it for now. You can proceed. Thank you.
Yep. So yes, the similar discipline is web and desktop. What we're looking for is, again, repeatability. This is just basic automation discipline when we're putting together a solution. We want repeatability. We want to be able to maintain things so we're not spending a lot of time updating code, that we can do things relatively quickly from maintaining all of our test cases. The things that are going to cause problems is if the application screen flows or objects change, then we're going to have to maintain our scripts. And then the user friendliness. Ideally, we'd like to develop solutions that we can hand off to more business or business analyst-minded people that know how the application is supposed to work. And if we're talking about business applications, they know how the business is supposed to be supported by the application that the development team is using. So if we can craft our automation solutions to be user-friendly so that we can hand off to them, we're essentially providing the ability for them to put their brain inside of the test cases and have full control over our automation solutions. So again, these were standard practices that were developed out of the web and desktop age, and they translate over nicely into mobile. It's just when it gets down into the technical weeds that it gets more difficult. So as a suggestion, if your goal is to have a small suite of test cases that you want to run maybe as smoke tests, or you want to run, just be able to do some basic verification for a long period of time, the tools that are out there right now, they all have created record and playback capability. And this can be good for, like I said, a small suite of tests. Record and playback is going to give you some maintenance headaches, but if the amount of tests that you have is small, it's not a huge problem to throw some scripts away and re-record them as you need to. Drag and drop here, there's solutions out there that give you the capability where it's more of a scriptless, that's the term, and you can pull over icons, and those icons have the logic or the coding, if you will, that makes some type of automation action occur, but it's presented in an abstract way. So a user can just fill out some screens, drag this icon over, and essentially create a linear test case using drag and drop capability. But once if you're in a situation where you have hundreds and thousands of test cases, then the common practices of creating either a keyword or data-driven framework is important. Again, some of the features that we want from a framework is to separate out test case data from scripts. It would be ideal if we could develop a test case once for one device and be able to run it on multiple devices. I put the word minimal in here because it doesn't work out that way, although it would be nice. And actually, that effect could be to be able to script once and run it on every device. That effect could be done theoretically, but it's not useful or practical, and I'll get into the reasons why in a minute. And what is suggested is actually separating the test cases as far as their specific data and the specific sequence that we put data on the screen is to have separate piles so that we can run this group of test cases so that we can have if we think about our test case bed being test case 1 through test case 100, we separate that out and run those on all the iPhone iOSs, on all the operating systems for iPhone. And then we have a separate grouping of those test cases 1 through 100 for Android, and a separate group of those same test cases for BlackBerry and Windows, if you will. And this next slide, we'll get into the reasoning for that. Any more questions up to this point, Reg?
No, you're good to go.
Okay. So what this diagram is showing is actually a framework design that we use here at Quillmont. And to explain this quickly, in column A, we use a relational database with 3 main tables that give us some functionality to basically to handle any maintenance issues that occur with our test cases. And we break that out by object table, number 1, data table, number 2, and a test case name. Now, in the object table, all we're doing is putting in information that's required for us to talk to an application on a particular operating system. So if we think of iPhone, all the objects are going to be property information. This table is going to contain information related to a text box that makes it unique from any other control that's in the application that runs on the phone. And this table is basically set up to contain all the objects that are in that particular application. They just live here. The data that is going to go into our test cases is going to populate in this table. And we're going to be able to relate that data to any of those objects that we want to communicate with that are going on in the object table. So this table holds all of the test case data that's in our entire test case bed. This could hold data for 100 test cases, but the object table just holds a static amount of object information depending on the objects that are inside of the application that's running on the device. And then test case name is pretty intuitive. It's just a way of grouping everything together, and these three hold together the relationship that make up the test case. Now, the sequence for that test case is controlled in column B, where a subject matter expert can use an abstract layer, and it'll be a user-friendly way, abstract layer meaning user-friendly way, of creating the sequence of automated test steps that they want and the specific data that's going to go into that test case. So once they're done building the steps 1 through 10 in a particular test case, and they want to save that sequence, that data that they created ultimately populates these relational tables, and a test case is created. And then the subject matter expert can move on to test case number 2, create another sequence of steps, and save it in these tables, and continue doing that until they've created their entire test bed. In column C, this is the actual scripting component, or the automation engine level. And the items, the code is written to conceptualize it, would be written in functions that are keywords. So this enter data would be a keyword that needs information about what it needs to do on the actual device, and it's going to get that information from what the subject matter expert had filled out here, and had saved that information over here. So this enter data would get information about the object that it wants to communicate to, and that would fill out a parameter inside of the enter data function. It would get the data that it needs to put inside of that object, and we can think about this filling out a username text box, and it would get that data, and in this case, let's say it's Patrick. And when it gets executed, it now knows which object or which text box to communicate with, because it's been given a property, and then it will put the data inside of the device on the application. The key here is to keep in mind that everything that's inside this OS box, the code that's in here, is specific for test cases that are run for iOS. Now, Android would have, from a name standpoint, from a keyword name standpoint, would have the exact same keywords. But the code in here would be a little bit different because it's going to interact with different Android devices. Now, some of you might be saying, well, why can't I just have at column B at the abstract level, why can't I just create some test case data once and then be able to have it run over here and have one set of keywords? And the answer is that gets very difficult to manage from a maintenance standpoint. One thing to keep in mind is that applications, when you read them, and just reading them and understanding them from a test case level, just reading a test case script, it seems like you should be able to do that. When you start getting down to the very specific details of creating the exact sequences, the applications sometimes, because they're running on different devices, will have a different sequence. They will also communicate with some different objects. Sometimes application development teams have to use radio buttons, where on their Android version of the application they're using checkboxes. So that's going to impact the objects that we're assigning the test case data to. That's going to impact perhaps the sequence that we need to fill out a test case. Sometimes on, again, if we want, for some reason we wanted to fill out, it was a requirement that in iOS we needed to fill out the password box before we fill out the username box, but in the Android version, it's the other way around. And sometimes those requirements are out there just by nature of iPhone having, in order to get an application into their store, they have different requirements that they expect you to adhere to, that Android does not have those restrictions. Then we need to be able to account for that inside of the solution that we're creating. So again, the recommendation is to keep the keywords separate by operating system. So there could be different versions of the operating system. So, but the idea is that anything that you can run on something like an iOS 5, you'd be able to run that on any lower version of iOS. And for Android, actually this works a little bit better from the fragmentation standpoint. If there's thousands of devices that are running Android, this simple keyword grouping here would run on all of those different Android devices. So that's the benefit. What we want to stay away from is trying to create something that's going to run both on iPhone and on Android. And it's not to say that that can't be done, but that decision is really going to be driven by the variations in the different applications. If we have if there's been a decision made by the development team to keep their iOS application very much in sync with their Android application, then that problem goes away and we can probably consolidate this a little bit more. But in our experience, that doesn't happen. There's a lot of variation, even though it doesn't seem like there would be. From an automation standpoint, there is, and that's why our number one suggestion is to separate things out like they are right here. And again, just highlights a little bit more, summarize a little bit more about what I was saying. These would run, this test case 1, again, is meant to set up to run on any iOS operating system, but being grouped together as just being designated for running on iOS operating systems. And its counterpart, test case 1, would run on Android, BlackBerry, and Windows. The test case names here, again, in the abstract layer. For quicker maintenance, if we wanted to update some similar information like username or password and we wanted to change that data all in one piece here, our relational ability, because we're breaking everything out into a relational table and putting these pieces in their logical spots, we're able to filter all of our test case 1s together regardless of family, operating system family, and fill out some data common across all platforms and update all of our test cases at once. Not all steps can be done that way, but the common ones, there's a way to group them together and update them all at once. So, Rich, before I move on, usually this slide generates some questions. Let me know.
Yeah, we're very pressed for time. We're already at the 1 hour mark. We have to actually move on very quickly. We'll address questions in the chat and the QA even after the session's over. Okay, very good. I will just, I'm not going to say too much about this since the time. There's some other slides here we need to get to. But basically, this is summarizes the way of bringing together a lot of the tool sets and gives a snapshot summary of where money should be spent once you get out of house with some of these solutions.
So I want to get to the more important things here. Reggie, do you want to take over at this point?
Yeah, thank you, Patrick. I do actually one other question to address before we move on to the last part of the presentation. There's a question on what tools, or do these automated tools support Unicode?
I'm not familiar with Unicode, so I need some background on that.
Okay, well, hopefully the person that asked that, if they can put that into the chat, we can further discuss it.
Yeah, that'd be great.
All right, so thanks, everybody. We only have a couple more slides, so feel free to stay and enjoy the rest of the presentation, as well as we will be answering questions through the chat panel and the Q&A panel as well. So what we have here is Patrick talked about the different methodologies and the different tools that you can use for test automation, specifically anything to do with mobile testing. And we wanted to, since we're co-sponsoring this particular presentation, we wanted to extend some information on the tools that we have that facilitate managing those operations on mobile devices. In particular, if you're not familiar, it's Polarian QA, which is our quality test management web-based platform. But you might not be aware of the fact that it's really a hub for managing all of your mobile activities. So whether it's your requirements that need to be linked to test cases, your load testing to performance testing, and all of your device testing, that can be managed right within the Polarian platform. So how it works is very simple. So what we would do is we'd actually create a test case, or test cases, obviously, in these particular cases. And then based on various scripts or builds, we can actually launch execution of the various activities you're doing. So in this example, it would be a test automation server. So you might actually be doing test automation, maybe it's performance testing on your mobile devices, and you would launch that from there. And then the actual performance or whatever the activity is would be executed. And what's really nice about it is that the results would actually be populated back into our Polarian server. And what you would get is you would actually get all the results managed, stored in Polarian QA. In this particular instance, we have here that a load testing was performed outside of Polarian QA, and we can see what all the activities that occurred. So whether it's an audit trail or what was executed, and even the linkage as well in the results. And then we've just recently launched Polarian 2013, so our newest release a couple weeks back, and we're proud to actually support what's called Reviewer for iOS. So we now have full mobile access for iOS. And if you want, you can actually look at your projects, your work items, your specification documents, your requirements, be able to review and approve them as well. And it's available at the App Store, and we'll give you some details on that as well. All right, so we had some other questions. And let's just see what there is here. So for those that have stayed, okay, so the question about the Unicode is supported, so that person hasn't actually gotten back to us. Okay, so question, will it be able to get a link to reply to this webinar after it's finished? Yes, of course. So this webinar has been recorded, and we will provide a link. It's available on our website, and then from a resource perspective, I'll just go over here. So if you'll notice that if you go to our website, and this PowerPoint will be available as well, is that all our webinars that are recorded actually get posted on our events underneath pre-recorded webinars. But we will make sure that everybody gets that as well. And yes, somebody else asked about the PowerPoint. We'll share it as well. Suppose my application is in Indian language, then can we test? So that would be a question for you, Patrick.
Yeah. There's actually for a lot. So assuming that you're going with a automation engine that has the ability to read text, to be able to, I guess the best way to go about it would be OCR, a tool that has OCR, which means the automation engine has visibility into the text that shows up on a mobile screen, and that'll read things at a character level. So if your application is rendering in an Indian language and you're putting in characters inside of your framework, if you will, to create any test case data, and your automation engine supports OCR, it should be able to scan the page that you're on, find the characters that you're looking for, and let's just say that that's a text, some type of text box, and it'll take your data and put it into that page. But the important thing there would be the OCR capability.
Great question here. Do you provide training, et cetera, on how to prepare test cases, framework, et cetera? Yeah, absolutely. So there are a couple of ways we can go about this. So depending on what you're actually looking for, and I would definitely encourage you to reach out to your local sales rep. But we actually have professional services and training, both online and on site, as well as Patrick's services. He provides extensive training and, in fact, has workshops on test automation, mobile testing, et cetera, et cetera. So certainly, if you actually are interested in any of these, don't hesitate to contact us. I've put up their contact information for both Polarian and for Patrick, and we'd be more than happy to actually help you out with that. Question, will you provide security testing tools for mobile devices? So the question, Patrick, is would you provide security testing tools for mobile devices?
We do not have any tools or in-house expertise on the security aspects of it. We're from an engineering standpoint. If you were interested in something like that, we could probably put you in touch with one of our partners that's more capable and actually does that type of security testing.
And it also depends on what kind of security tools you're looking for. On the Polarian side, our ALM software product is extensible from an integration point of view. So we provide the test management framework, but we also integrate with various other testing tools. So if there's a specific tool, we might either have integrated with it, or there's a possibility that we could integrate with it.
Hey, Reg, just to add some, I meant to add this to the last part about the training. What we have, the specific training that we do have is tailored towards Android automation, and it's actually a workshop that will let you download an application, play around with it as a developer would in Eclipse, and then create some automation using all open source tools.
Great. Thank you very much. Okay, so we're 10 minutes past the time. We'll end the conference, the teleconference portion of this webinar. However, feel free to stay on the Q&A and chat session, and both Patrick, myself, and other moderators will be more than happy to stay another 10-15 minutes and answer any questions you may have. Thank you very much, everyone, and thank you, Patrick, and have a great day.
Thanks.